Hey, my name's Zach. I read a lot of fantasy, science fiction, and horror, so if you're interested in those things, maybe stick around. This is a newer channel, so while I don't have a lot of videos yet, my plan is to start releasing a weekly update as to the things I've been reading, the things I'm currently reading, what my TBR is looking like, as well as initial impressions and thoughts on the books that I'm reading. I may do dedicated book reviews at some point in the future, I haven't quite decided. Either way, if you're interested in any of that stuff, I'd love it if you subscribed or watched the video. So as a quick wrap up for the past month, I finished The Inheritance Cycle by Christopher Paolini. I started a reread of that series at the end of last year in anticipation of Murtagh, which is a new book Paolini released set in the world of Alagaësia after the events of that series. Now, I loved Aragon when I was a teenager, but I had never finished the fourth book for whatever reason. It came out when I was kind of in my college years. I was just moving out and becoming an adult. I just didn't get around to it. And it's been on my list for a long time. I think part of my hesitation has been that I wasn't sure if the series would hold up very well because it's a little bit younger in its target audience. I mean, Christopher Paolini wrote the first book when he was like 15 or 16, which is incredibly impressive in its own right. But with the release of Murtagh, I decided it was time. I'm going to reread the series and I'm going to finish the fourth book, Inheritance. I'm happy to say that I really enjoyed it. It has some issues. I wouldn't say it's pushing the boundaries of fantasy as a genre or anything like that. There's definitely some derivative aspects of the series. That's also part of its charm. It has a really good mix of fun, classical, tropey things. I think that's to its benefit and to its detriment. So if you really like Dragon Riders, a la Dragon Riders of Pern, if you loved the magic system in Ursula Le Guin's Earthsea books, or even Name of the Wind, where there's an ancient language and names have great power, it has that too. If you liked the plot of Star Wars, this has a lot of those beats that are in there. And it also has very archetypal characters that you'd expect from like a sword and sorcery fantasy type book. Now, some people don't love it for that. I think the more experienced you are in the fantasy genre, the more derivative this will feel. But if you're kind of missing those cozy comforts, you might still like this. And that's where I found myself. I've read a lot of fantasy since these books came out and since I was a teenager. And so I found certain aspects a lot more derivative than they felt at the time I read this as a kid. But to its credit, I think Paolini crafted the story well. He has a lot of interesting and sympathetic characters. Saphira as a dragon was really good. There's a lot of cool side characters in this. And the fourth book really surprised me. So as a wrap up for this month, the third book, Brissinger, that's the first book that I actually completed in 2024. That's probably the slowest and the most boring of all the books. I wish that was trimmed down a lot, or even that it could have been a trilogy. Thankfully, Inheritance, I thought the fourth book would be my least favorite. It might be one of my favorites in the series. There are a lot of cool events and locations and set pieces that happen in this book. Christopher Paolini had some really creative and interesting ideas that he explored. And while the execution didn't go exactly where I wanted, like the resolution he chose to some of the main plot elements wasn't what I would have preferred, I still liked overall what he did with it. And I thought it was a relatively satisfying conclusion. And at the end of book 4, I was kind of sad to see those characters go. So I'm excited that I still have Murtagh. I haven't picked that up yet. I'll probably read it sometime later in the year. But yeah, that was a pleasant surprise. Thankfully, one of my childhood favorites held up well enough that I enjoyed it. The next book I finished last month was The Tusks of Extinction by Ray Naylor. This is a novella, a sci-fi novella, kind of an eco-thriller. Essentially, this book is about Russian scientists managed to resurrect the species of the woolly mammoth sometime in the future. Unfortunately, this new mammoth population is struggling to integrate with the ecology of today. The world is very different in this near future than it was 5 to 10,000 years ago. The nascent woolly mammoth population is dying off. What they need is someone who's an expert in mammoth behavior, which of course no one is. However, elephant behavior is close enough that it might be a passable substitute. The next problem is that the last great elephant expert died a few decades prior to this story from elephant poachers, before elephants went extinct. And because the elephant has been extinct for decades, there are not really any modern day specialists in elephant behavior. What the Russian scientists managed to do is they're able to bring back a consciousness of this elephant scientist that was uploaded shortly before her death and take her consciousness and implant it into the matriarch of the woolly mammoths, essentially making her the leader of the woolly mammoths so that she can help them establish their population and thrive. And of course, there are a lot of complications along the way. This is a relatively short book. You can get through it in a day or two, which is always nice, especially as fantasy readers. Half the time I'm reading 800 to 1,000 page tomes. But this was fun. The ideas are very interesting. I thought Naylor's characterization in such a short page count was very effective. And honestly, this raises a lot of interesting questions about ecology and the impact we as humans have on other species and the overall biosphere that we are a part of. This isn't about one species going extinct. It's about the interconnected network that humanity is a part of. We are still a part of this ecology. Even though in some ways we've transcended, in a lot of ways we are still very dependent on the environment. And it's cool. You can very much get a lot of Ray Naylor's background as an environmental scientist. So there's kind of a different flavor this sci-fi has compared to other science fiction writers. Anyway, if you haven't read anything by Ray Naylor, which I hadn't at this point, this is a great place to start. The next book I finished in January is The Bee Sting by Paul Murray. Paul Murray is an Irish author. This is more literary. So again, usually my channel's sci-fi fantasy, but occasionally I stray out of the bounds. I go into literary, I'll go into a nonfiction book or a historical fiction book. It's been known to happen. The Bee Sting is a beautiful family saga. This is a tour de force, honestly. A multi-generational story centered around the core family, a mom and a dad and their 2 kids. On the surface, their lives are great. The dad has a successful business that he inherited from his wealthy father. The wife is beloved in town. She's a socialite. She's beautiful. Everybody adores her. The children are very smart. The oldest girl, Cass, is about to go to college and she's prepping for her exams. And the younger child, PJ, he's kind of middle school aged. He has just a voracious mind for facts, especially about like nature and animals and biology. Kind of a quirky but endearing kid. And so it seems like their life is great. However, each of them has their own secrets and problems. Each of them is kind of lonely. And even though they're all together, they're not really there for each other. This book is dealing with layers of generational trauma where events that happened in the parents' lives when they were young are having a ripple effect outward on their kids in modern day. And so this story is a story about them and their family, but also about the parents and what happened to them when they were young, how it has shaped their relationships with each other and with the community and with, especially with the father or the grandfather figure. This book gets surprisingly tense by the end of it, as it brings to a head all of the tension and unresolved problems and secrets kept held deep down by each family member from each other to the point where they feel like they just can't talk to one another. And even though some of their problems could be solved by them sitting down and just having a conversation, which, as a side note, that's like a common complaint about books. It's like, oh, the whole plot could be resolved by them talking. But the point of this book is that sometimes you can't talk with the people you love because of shame, because of guilt, because of trauma. And all of these things kind of put you in this horrible, lonely place, even from those that you desperately love. Anyway, this was beautiful. It was great. If you are at all inclined to either literary fiction or family dramas, then this one is a must pick up, I think. The next book I just recently finished is Sky's End by Mark J. Gregson. Now, this is YA. I also don't tend to read a ton of YA, which is ironic because I've had Aragon and another YA book within one like weekly update video. So maybe I'm going into my YA era as a man in his 30s. Sky's End is a fantasy book that has been described as Attack on Titan meets Hunger Games. I would also throw in Final Fantasy. This is cool. This is about an archipelago of islands that are floating in the sky, and everybody travels via airship. However, there are these giant air serpents that are like, hundreds to thousands of feet long that prowl the skies and occasionally will come and just decimate a sky island or a city. They're terrifying. And so to keep these creatures back, they have what's called the hunters, who fly out on airships and hunt these things. And what's cool is like it kind of works with the world building where elements they harvest from these sea creatures called gorgontons, they have like these gaseous sacs in them that allows them to float and fly. And so they use those in their airships so their airships can fly. And the steel scales from the serpents are what they use to reinforce their hulls. It was cool. I liked the world. In some ways, this was very standard YA fare. Like the plot and a lot of the character interactions felt very YA, which isn't my favorite, like a little bit angsty, a little bit broody. Some of the plot felt kind of contrived. However, by the end, this focuses on a character who becomes a part of a crew, an up-and-coming young crew of new hunters. I liked the crew dynamic by the end, and it was fun. The world building was very fascinating, and there are some interesting plot threads that are not resolved that kind of are opened up at the end of this book that make me excited to pick up the second one. So if you like YA and any of that sounds cool, I'd recommend it. It's not going to blow your mind. And yeah, I've always loved floating sky islands and giant sea serpents that like fly through the skies. Yeah. Okay, so that's what I've finished reading. That kind of was a monthly wrap-up. These will normally be weekly wrap-ups. But let's talk about books that I'm reading right now. First of all, I'm in the middle of the Expanse series. I read the first 3 books in the Expanse over the past year or so, and I really like them, and I'm just continuing on with it. This is the 4th book, Cibola Burn, I don't know how to pronounce that, but this is awesome. It's hard to go too in detail with this without giving spoilers away, but it focuses on Holden and the crew of the Rocinante. The main difference here is they are exploring a planet that is farther than any they've explored yet. That's all I'll say. And some of the problems that happen on this alien planet are interesting. There are some biological elements of this planet that are fascinating. If you like The Expanse and you've started it, then I would say continue. I'm probably 3/4 of the way through this. I think I'll finish it in the next week or two. I've been mixing between reading the physical copy as well as listening to it on audiobook. And the audiobook narrator, whose name I'm spacing at the moment, he does an excellent job narrating this series. So if you want a good audiobook series, The Expanse is definitely it. So yeah, I'm hoping to, I don't know if I'll get through all 9 books this year, but I'm going to try to, because James S.A. Corey actually has a new book. I'm forgetting the title. I'll put a picture of the cover up here. Memory of the Gods, maybe, something like that. His James S.A. Corey, which is actually a duo, their new book comes out in, I think, August of this year. So I would like to finish The Expanse before I get into their new series, so we'll see if I can do that. Another book I'm currently reading is East of Eden by John Steinbeck. It's a classical work. I don't read a ton of classics. I am trying to change that. I'm intrigued by the idea of classics. I want to be the type of person who's read a lot of these wonderfully acclaimed books from the past couple hundred years. But in practice, they're kind of intimidating. They're long. A lot of times, the style of writing is harder for me to engage with mentally. But this one is one I've heard great things about. John Steinbeck wrote The Grapes of Wrath, which is super well renowned, as is this was maybe his magnum opus. I finally decided to pick it up. It was just calling out to me. So I started reading it, I think the day before yesterday as of filming, and I'm about a quarter of the way into it. I'm surprised at how engrossing this book is, which is funny because John Steinbeck is obviously one of the best writers in American history. Like, you could argue this is the great American novel. And yeah, I see it. I really see it. The problem is a lot of times those descriptions will be like, I'll start to read it and I'm like, I can tell this is quality, but I'm not necessarily having a great time. I am having a great time with this book. I'm having trouble putting it down. This is another family saga. I guess I'm finding out that I enjoy family sagas. This is also sort of a literary reinterpretation of the book of Genesis, which that's kind of bold, right? Like sometimes you'll hear about like, oh, someone's going to do their own spin on Beauty and the Beast. And it's like, oh, okay, whatever. If someone's like, hey, I'm going to do my own version of the Bible. It's like, well, wow. You better be a good writer if you're going to take on something that ambitious. But Steinbeck is. This book focuses on 2 different families, the Hamiltons and the Trasks. And it's set in the Salinas Valley in Northern California. And so far, it is a story about all of the problems that can arise between family members, jealousy and a desire to be loved by those you love, and how that's not always reciprocated, and the effects that can start to follow when children do not get the love they need, or when people don't have kind of a reciprocal love from those they care about. And there's also elements of wealth disparity that are already being explored between those who are very poor, even though maybe they shouldn't be, whereas those who've become very rich, maybe on accident. Anyway, I love this. The writing is absolutely gorgeous. This guy Steinbeck, watch out for him. He might be going somewhere. Okay, so I'm also reading The Lost Metal by Brandon Sanderson. I'm reading that on my Kindle. Usually I read on my Kindle before falling asleep, so that's a little slower going. It kind of depends on how tired I am. I have 2 kids, so often I'm very tired. So I'll get through maybe a page or 2 and then fall asleep. Sometimes I get through a little more. I've been slow rolling the second era of Mistborn on Kindle for the past year or so to reread that whole series so that I can finish The Lost Metal, which is the conclusion to Mistborn Era 2 with Wax and Wayne and Marcy and Steris. And I really enjoy it. The first two Wax and Wayne books were fun, but didn't blow my mind. The third book started to up the ante and really make me care about a lot of the characters. Steris, in particular, has really become just like a beloved character in this series for me. And now The Lost Metal's awesome. You can really see Brandon Sanderson firing on all cylinders, bringing together all his different Cosmere threads, all his characters, and just the way he's able to weave in worlds and scope and all the stuff happening, and yet it's still very digestible, is truly impressive. I know some people talk about Sanderson being not as good of a writer, or his prose isn't as good, and yet his prose is a lot more utilitarian and basic in delivery in some ways, but the amount of information he can convey simply in a way that's digestible, and the huge ideas he can explore in a way that is understandable, is honestly pretty impressive. So loving that. I'm like not quite halfway through The Lost Metal. I'll probably finish that over the next couple of months. Again, it's going to take me a little bit. The last thing, I haven't quite started this yet, is Gardens of the Moon by Steven Erikson. I've read this book twice now, and I liked it. Malazan is such a unique beast. The reason I kind of want to pick it up again is because apparently everybody's reading this book this year. The Book Reviews Kill podcast is doing a read of this series. A lot of people on BookTube or Book Talk are reading it, and I got FOMO. I wanted to be along for the ride, but I haven't started it yet. I'm hoping to start that in the next week or so. I've only gotten to the third book in the series, and I want to finish it. I want to have read this. These books are a little difficult for me to get through, but I also do really enjoy them. Steven Erikson's world building is some of the most interesting and some of the most epic ever. And I think he's a very good writer. He has a poetic style about his writing too. I think what makes these so hard is just the amount of characters you have to jump in and out of. It jumps all over the place. It's hard to keep track of everything, and it's hard to get super invested in a single person because you're just jumping between so many different people. Anyway, excited to get back into Malazan. So that's it. Some other books I'm considering for my TBR after I finish East of Eden and Malazan and Sibylla Byrne. I'll probably continue The Expanse on audiobook and sometimes read physical as well with the fifth book, Nemesis Games. Another book I kind of want to read is Legendborn by Tracy Dion. It's a YA book, yet another YA book, but it's been on my list for a couple of years, and I've heard people rave about it. So I might pick that up, something that's probably a little easier to get through since it's YA. I could probably get through that in a couple of days. And then after that, we'll see. I'm toying with either starting The Live Ship Traders by Robin Hobb, starting with Ship of Magic. I've heard absolutely incredible things about it. I've read the first Farseer trilogy, and I've read the first book in the second trilogy with Fitz, Fool's Errand, and I love everything I've read by Robin Hobb so far. I do think she's one of the best fantasy authors in the past couple decades, so I'm kind of toying with picking one of those up. Yeah, that's been my week in reading. So let's talk TV shows and movies for a second, because I've watched some really cool stuff recently. Blue-Eyed Samurai. If you haven't watched it, it's on Netflix. It is so incredible. The animation is amazing. The fight sequences are so cool. The story is really interesting. It has super, super compelling characters. I highly recommend it. If you like samurai stuff, if you like swords, just in general, go watch Blue-Eyed Samurai. Content warning, there is a lot of violence in it, and there is some nudity. So if you got kids, just be careful. There is there is a bit of a content warning there. Another series I recently finished is Scavenger's Reign, which is a sci-fi series, and this is about a ship that crash lands on an alien planet, kind of off in the middle of nowhere, and the various crew members are struggling to survive. What makes this show so unique and so worth watching is the alien life in this show is so distinct from anything I've ever seen. It's some of the most unique and creative ideas of what life can be, and the life all works together in these weird kind of symbiotic ways that is both mesmerizing, beautiful, grotesque, and absolutely deadly to the people that are on this planet. There are some horrifying things in this show. It is such a stark balance between beauty and utter horror. The things that happen to some of these characters is very disturbing, but there is an undercurrent of hope of these people finding a way to survive and try and get back to their crash-landed ship so they can escape this terrifying planet. This is really, really good. If you like sci-fi at all, I highly recommend you check out Scavenger's Reign. Final thing I watched this year Godzilla Minus One, I saw it for a second time. Best movie that I saw last year, which it feels crazy to say about a Godzilla movie. They're kind of a dime a dozen, right? There's been a bunch of Godzilla and Kong movies in past years. This is one you don't want to miss. Godzilla Minus One. Even if you don't care about Godzilla, this is an incredibly well-made film about post-World War II Japan and the fallout that's having on Japan as a nation and people who are trying to pick up the pieces. Godzilla happens to be in it too and is also wreaking havoc. So this is an incredible movie. Incredibly well directed and shot. The acting is awesome. The writing is great. The music, the score, and everything they were able to achieve with this movie. Honestly, this looks as good as most big budget movies these days, but they did it for $15 million, which is a pittance compared to like what Marvel movies get. So if it's still in theaters near you, I recommend seeing this one in theaters. It's worth it. I think Godzilla Minus One Zero Color is out. It's like a black and white version. Go see that too. Like it's really good. And then finally, what have I been playing? I've been playing Prince of Persia, a Ubisoft game that was just released. And, Ubisoft has been kind of hit or miss for a while, but they have knocked it out of the park with this one. If you like Metroidvania games, if you like something like Hollow Knight, Prince of Persia, check it out. It's so good. Even if you haven't played much in the way of Metroidvanias, this is some of the best combat and traversal in modern video games. Just a great world design, great bosses, and an interesting story. Prince of Persia is awesome, and I think it's only $50, so it's not as expensive as a normal full-length game. And then we have Final Fantasy VII Rebirth, the second Final Fantasy VII of the remake games, coming out in a couple of weeks. So I started a replay of Final Fantasy VII, the original, on my Switch. I don't know if I'll finish it, but that's kind of been my cozy go-to game. So that's it. That's my weekly update. Thanks for listening. Let me know in the comments, what have you been reading? What have you been watching or playing? I'd love to hear about it. And yeah, I'll catch you next week with my next update.